3 years ago, on an entirely ordinary Thursday evening, standing in my own hallway with a cup of tea in my hand, about to walk into my kitchen to say goodnight to my son and his wife before they left, I heard a sentence through a partially closed door that I've thought about nearly every single day since. Honestly, Denise, the doctor didn't even sound that concerned. Dad won't last the year anyway, the way his heart's been going. There's no point stressing over exactly how we split things now when the timeline's probably going to sort itself out on its own.
I stood in that hallway, tea going cold in my hand, listening to my own son discuss my death with the specific, casual practicality of someone discussing a delayed flight or a minor scheduling inconvenience. I want to tell you exactly what happened over the following 3 years, because that single overheard sentence, delivered in a tone I still remember with unsettling clarity, didn't just reveal something troubling about how my son actually saw me. It set into motion a series of quiet decisions on my part that culminated, 3 years later, in a conversation that changed our relationship. My name is Norman. I'm 71 years old, and this is the story of the night I discovered my own son was quietly waiting for me to die, and the 3 years I spent proving him wrong, while carefully, methodically ensuring his miscalculation would cost him considerably more than he ever anticipated.
If you've ever discovered that someone close to you had already, in some fundamental way, written you off, stay with me until the end, because I promise you this story goes somewhere considerably more satisfying than simple hurt feelings. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Let me take you back to that evening in more detail, because understanding exactly what I heard and the context surrounding it matters considerably to everything that followed. I'd had a cardiology appointment earlier that week, a routine follow-up related to a heart condition I'd been managing for several years. Nothing acute, nothing that my cardiologist, Dr. Ferris, had characterized as urgent or immediately concerning. Simply the ordinary monitoring that comes with an aging heart and a family history that made regular checkups sensible. I'd mentioned the appointment to my son, Peter, in passing during a phone call, the way I might mention any routine medical appointment, giving him a general update without any particular sense of alarm, because there genuinely wasn't any alarm to give. Peter and his wife Denise had come over for dinner that evening, an ordinary Thursday gathering that had become something of a regular tradition since my own wife, Judith, passed 4 years earlier. I want to explain something about my relationship with Judith and how her death shaped the years that followed, because I think it matters to understanding why that overheard comment affected me as deeply as it did.
Judith and I were married 38 years before ovarian cancer took her, a difficult 2-year battle that Peter, an only child, witnessed closely, staying involved throughout her treatment in ways that, at the time, I genuinely appreciated as evidence of real filial devotion. After she died, Peter and Denise began coming over regularly, initially, I believe, out of genuine concern for how I was managing alone in the house Judith and I had shared for over 3 decades. I welcomed those visits deeply during that first difficult year, grateful for the company, grateful for a connection to family that helped fill the specific, enormous silence Judith's absence had left in that house. I remember, specifically, the weeks immediately following Judith's funeral, the particular quality of silence that settles into a house after decades of shared life suddenly becomes solitary life instead. Peter and Denise came by almost every evening during that first month, sometimes just to sit with me,
sometimes to help with the overwhelming practical tasks that follow any death, notifying accounts, sorting through Judith's belongings, handling the endless small administrative details that grief somehow makes exponentially more exhausting than they would otherwise be. I remember being
Profoundly grateful during that period, telling friends at the time that I didn't know how I would have managed that first year without my son's steady, consistent presence. I'd retired 8 years earlier from a career as a civil engineer, spending 32 years designing bridges and infrastructure projects across the state, work that had provided, among other things, a genuinely comfortable retirement, a paid-off house, healthy retirement accounts, and a modest but meaningful stock portfolio I'd built carefully over decades through consistent, unglamorous investing rather than any particular risk-taking.
I want to say a bit more about that career because I think it matters to understanding the particular way I approached the years that followed my discovery. Engineering, and bridge design specifically, taught me something about patience and long-term thinking that shaped nearly every significant decision I made throughout my adult life. You don't build a structure meant to stand for 80 or 100 years by rushing toward quick, satisfying conclusions. You build it carefully, methodically, checking and rechecking your calculations, understanding that the visible structure represents only.
I've come to understand, looking back, that this same instinct shaped how I approached the 3 years following that overheard conversation. Not through some single dramatic confrontation, but through careful, deliberate, foundational restructuring that would prove sound regardless of how or when the eventual reckoning with Peter finally arrived.
That Thursday evening, after dinner, Denise had gone to help me clear dishes, while Peter stepped into what I'd always called my study, a small room off the kitchen where I kept my desk and, at the time, a stack of paperwork related to some minor updates I'd been considering for my estate planning. Updates that, I want to be clear, had nothing to do with any sense of urgency about my health, simply the kind of routine review any responsible person conducts periodically, as circumstances and tax laws shift over time. I'd stepped away briefly to use the bathroom, and on my way back toward the kitchen, tea in hand, I heard Peter's voice through the partially closed study door, apparently on the phone with Denise, who I'd assumed was still in the kitchen, but had evidently stepped away briefly herself to take his call from another room.
I want to describe the specific quality of what I overheard, because the tone mattered as much as the words themselves. Peter wasn't speaking with any evident malice or cruelty. His voice carried the same casual, practical register you might use discussing a household budget or a minor logistical decision, entirely devoid of the gravity I would have expected from a son discussing his own father's mortality.
Honestly, Denise, the doctor didn't even sound that concerned. Dad won't last the year anyway, the way his heart's been going. There's no point stressing over exactly how we split things now, when the timeline's probably going to sort itself out on its own.
I stood frozen in that hallway for what felt like considerably longer than it probably actually was, my tea growing cold in my hand, trying to process what I was hearing. My cardiology appointment that week had involved no such dire prognosis whatsoever. Dr. Ferris had, if anything, expressed satisfaction with how well my condition was being managed through medication and lifestyle adjustments, projecting, in his own words, no reason you shouldn't be around causing trouble for another 15 or 20 years if you keep taking care of yourself. Peter's characterization of the appointment
bore no resemblance whatsoever to what had actually been discussed.
I want to be honest about the specific layers of hurt contained in that single overheard sentence, because I think understanding them fully matters to everything I did over the following 3 years. There was first the immediate sting of hearing my own mortality discussed with such casual detachment, as though my death were simply a scheduling variable to be factored into some larger equation, rather than something that would represent a genuine loss to the people around me. But underneath that immediate sting was something considerably more troubling: the specific phrase, "how we split."
Things, suggesting conversations about my estate, my assets, decisions about my life's accumulated work, had apparently already been happening between Peter and Denise, quietly, in advance of any actual medical urgency, based on nothing more than Peter's own apparent eagerness to fabricate a more dire prognosis than actually existed.
The rest of that evening passed in a strange, disorienting fog, my mind still replaying that overheard sentence while I tried to behave normally through the remaining hour of Peter and Denise's visit. I didn't confront Peter that evening. I want to explain why, because I think the decision to remain quiet, at least initially, mattered considerably to how the following 3 years eventually unfolded. I was, in that moment, still processing genuine shock, and some part of me, still raw from Judith's death 4 years earlier, wasn't prepared to risk losing my remaining relationship with my only child over a single overheard conversation, however troubling its content. I finished that evening behaving exactly as I always had, saying goodnight to Peter and Denise with the same warmth I'd shown throughout dinner, giving no indication whatsoever that I'd heard anything unusual. I hugged Peter goodnight at the door, exactly as I always did, and I remember walking back into my quiet house afterward, sitting alone at my kitchen table for a very long time, the cold tea still sitting untouched beside me. But I want to tell you what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because that single overheard sentence quietly reshaped nearly every significant decision I made over the following 3 years, even as I maintained, on the surface, an entirely ordinary relationship with my son. The first thing I did, about a week after that dinner, was schedule a comprehensive meeting with my estate attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia Alvarez, who'd handled Judith's and my affairs for nearly 2 decades. I didn't tell her, initially, the specific reason for my sudden interest in a comprehensive review, framing it instead as routine due diligence, given that I hadn't formally updated anything since Judith's passing 4 years earlier. I want to describe what emerged from that review process, because it revealed something I hadn't previously fully examined about my own existing estate planning. My will, drafted originally many years earlier and updated only minimally after Judith's death, named Peter as sole beneficiary of essentially everything: the house, my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, decades of careful, unglamorous accumulation representing the entirety of my life's financial legacy. There had never been any particular reason to question this arrangement before, given that Peter was my only child and our relationship had, on its surface, always seemed warm and genuine. Patricia noticed during that initial meeting that something about my demeanor seemed different from our previous interactions, a certain guardedness she hadn't observed in our prior work together over the years. About halfway through our discussion, she set down her pen and asked me directly, with the particular gentle bluntness that comes from decades of experience navigating families through difficult transitions, "Norman, is there something specific that's prompted this review? I don't need details if you're not comfortable sharing them, but it would help me structure things more effectively if I understood what's actually driving the changes you're describing." I told her, after a moment's hesitation, exactly what I'd overheard, and I remember her expression shifting from professional neutrality into something more personally affected. Having handled enough estate planning over her career, she later admitted, to have seen versions of this particular pattern more times than she wished were true. I began, over the following months, a careful and deliberate process of restructuring. Not out of anger exactly,
though I won't pretend anger wasn't present in some of my thinking during those early weeks, but out of a specific desire to protect myself and my legacy from a son who had apparently already begun mentally allocating my assets based on a fabricated timeline for my death. I want to explain the specific changes I made because I think the deliberativeness of the process matters to understanding how thoroughly that single overheard sentence reshaped my approach to my own remaining years. I established a charitable remainder trust, directing a meaningful portion of my investment portfolio toward funding engineering scholarships at the state university where I'd studied decades earlier, a cause that had always mattered to me, but that I'd never previously formalized into anything beyond occasional smaller donations. I updated my healthcare proxy, moving that responsibility from Peter to a longtime friend, Councilman Everett Doyle, someone I'd known since our engineering days together and trusted implicitly, given the specific circumstances I'd just discovered. I also began, quietly and without any dramatic announcement, rebuilding relationships and connections that I'd allowed to lapse somewhat during my years of grief following Judith's death and subsequent close reliance on Peter and Denise as my primary social connection. I reconnected with several old colleagues from my engineering career, rejoined a hiking club Judith and I had been part of years earlier, before her illness made such activities impossible, began volunteering weekly at a bridge design workshop for local high school students interested in engineering, work that brought me genuine joy and purpose in ways I hadn't fully experienced since Judith's death. I remember the specific nervousness of showing up to that first hiking club meeting after nearly 6 years away, half expecting the group to have moved on entirely without me, and instead finding several familiar faces genuinely delighted to see me return, a warmth that reminded me, in a way I hadn't fully appreciated during my years of isolation with grief, how much of my identity and community had existed entirely independent of my relationship with Peter and Denise. The high school workshop, similarly, became something considerably more significant to me than I'd initially anticipated. Watching teenagers discover the same fascination with structural engineering that had defined most of my own adult life, several of them asking increasingly sophisticated questions during our sessions that reminded me, week after week, of exactly why I'd chosen that career in the first place, decades earlier, before any of the complications of family or estate planning had ever entered the picture. I want to be clear that none of this represented an attempt to punish Peter specifically, though I understand how it might appear that way from the outside. It represented, more fundamentally, a decision to actively live the remaining years I had, however many that might turn out to be, rather than passively existing in a pattern of dependency on a son who had apparently already, in some meaningful sense, begun grieving me while I was still very much alive, and according to my actual cardiologist, likely to remain that way for considerably longer than Peter had apparently assumed. I continued throughout these 3 years, maintaining an entirely normal-seeming relationship with Peter and Denise. Thursday dinners continued largely as before. Holiday gatherings proceeded normally. I gave no outward indication whatsoever that anything had changed in how I understood our relationship, even as, privately, I'd fundamentally restructured both my legal affairs and my broader approach to living independently of my son's apparent assumptions about my remaining timeline. The 18 months between that first overheard conversation and the kitchen renovation discussion passed in a strange dual reality. On the surface, an entirely ordinary continuation of Thursday dinners and holiday gatherings, while underneath, I was quietly rebuilding nearly every meaningful aspect of my life independent of the assumptions I now understood Peter had been operating under. I want to describe a specific moment about 18 months after that initial overheard conversation because it revealed something further about the pattern of thinking Peter had apparently developed.
Regarding my eventual death, during a Thursday dinner, Peter mentioned, somewhat casually, a home renovation project he and Denise were considering, a significant kitchen remodel that would require, by his own estimate, somewhere around $80,000 they didn't currently have readily available.
"We've actually been thinking," he said, glancing briefly at Denise before continuing, "that it might make sense to look into some kind of bridge financing, maybe secured against the eventual inheritance, given the house and everything else. I know it's a little morbid to talk about, Dad, but practically speaking, it could help us move forward with the renovation now rather than waiting." I want to describe what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't simple anger so much as a kind of confirmed, resigned understanding. Peter was, quite literally, asking me to help him structure a loan against my own anticipated death, a request delivered with the same casual practicality I'd overheard 18 months earlier, revealing that the mindset behind that original comment hadn't diminished or been reconsidered in any meaningful way, but had, if anything, solidified into something he now felt comfortable raising directly with me. I told him, calmly, that I wasn't interested in exploring any financing arrangement tied to inheritance expectations, framing my refusal simply as general financial caution rather than revealing the specific, deeper reason behind my discomfort with the request. He seemed mildly disappointed, but didn't press the issue further, and the conversation moved on to other topics. I remember lying awake that particular night, considerably longer than usual, turning that renovation conversation over in my mind, testing it against the initial comment I'd overheard 18 months earlier, trying to determine whether I was perhaps being unfair, reading too much into an entirely ordinary request that many adult children might reasonably make of an aging parent. I concluded eventually that the timing and framing of both conversations, separated by well over a year, yet carrying nearly identical underlying assumptions about my mortality as a financial planning variable.
I want to tell you about the third year, because it was during this period that circumstances finally converged in a way that led to the confrontation I'd been quietly, patiently building toward, without fully articulating even to myself that I was building toward anything at all.
About 2 months before that confrontation, I experienced a genuine, though relatively minor, cardiac event, an episode of atrial fibrillation that, while not immediately life-threatening, did require a brief hospitalization and a subsequent adjustment to my medication regimen. Peter and Denise both visited during that hospitalization, appropriately concerned, and I want to be honest that watching their genuine worry during that period complicated my understanding of everything I'd overheard 3 years earlier, forcing me to reconcile the casual, calculating comment I'd overheard with the evidently real concern I was now witnessing directly. I remember, specifically, Denise sitting beside my hospital bed for nearly 4 hours that first evening, holding my hand, her genuine fear visible in a way that felt entirely inconsistent with the casual practicality I'd overheard 18 months earlier during the renovation conversation. Peter, too, seemed authentically shaken, canceling work meetings to remain at the hospital, asking Dr. Ferris detailed, anxious questions about my prognosis and recovery timeline. I found myself, during those hospital days, genuinely uncertain about how to reconcile these two seemingly contradictory versions of my son. The one capable of discussing my death with cold practicality, and the one now sitting anxiously at my bedside, apparently terrified of actually losing me. During my recovery, staying temporarily with Peter and Denise for about a week while I regained enough strength to safely manage independently again, I overheard, entirely by accident, a second conversation that ultimately prompted the confrontation I'd been quietly preparing for over the preceding 3 years.
I was resting in their guest room, door slightly ajar, when I heard Denise's voice from the hallway, apparently speaking with Peter in a nearby room. "This is what I was worried about happening eventually," she was saying. "We really do need to have the conversation about the house and the accounts, properly this time, now that something's actually happened. I know you've been putting it off since that first scare a few years back, but we can't keep avoiding it just because it makes you uncomfortable."
I know. It's just uncomfortable talking about, especially with him right down the hall. But you're right, we probably do need to finally sit down and figure out exactly how everything's structured once
"He's gone."
I spent that recovery week at my own house alone, once I'd insisted I was well enough to manage independently, turning over everything I'd overheard in Peter and Denise's hallway, weighing it against 3 years of quiet restructuring, against the genuine fear I'd witnessed in my own hospital bedside, trying to arrive at some clear understanding of what I actually wanted from the conversation I now understood I could no longer indefinitely postpone. I want to tell you what happened the following week, once I'd fully recovered and returned to my own house, because I decided finally, after 3 years of quiet, deliberate preparation, that the time had come for the conversation I'd been avoiding. I invited Peter and Denise over for what I framed simply as an ordinary Thursday dinner, giving no indication that anything unusual was planned. After dinner, once the dishes were cleared, I asked them both to sit with me in the living room, and I told them, calmly and without dramatic preamble, exactly what I'd overheard 3 years earlier, word for word, as precisely as I could recall it. I watched their faces move through a rapid sequence of reactions, initial confusion, then a dawning, horrified recognition as they understood exactly which conversation I was referencing, and finally, something that looked like genuine shame, particularly from Peter, whose face had gone notably pale by the time I finished recounting what I'd heard. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even remember saying that, but I believe you heard it. I don't know what to say except that I'm horrified, hearing it repeated back to me now, at how callous it sounds."
"I need you to understand something," I said. "That comment didn't just hurt me in the moment, though it did hurt considerably. It fundamentally changed how I approached the last 3 years of my life. Every significant decision I've made since that evening, the scholarship fund, the changes to my healthcare proxy, rebuilding relationships I'd let lapse, even simply choosing to actively engage with life again, rather than quietly waiting around for whatever timeline you'd apparently already mentally assigned to me. All of it happened because I overheard you discussing my death with less
genuine concern than you'd probably show discussing a delayed flight. I remember the specific quality of silence that filled my living room as I walked through each piece of the restructuring, watching my son absorb, one detail at a time, exactly how thoroughly a single careless sentence had reshaped his own eventual inheritance, watching him understand, gradually, that this wasn't some abstract possibility, but a fully realized, legally formalized reality that had been quietly taking shape around him for 3 entire years, while he continued attending ordinary Thursday dinners with no idea whatsoever that anything had fundamentally shifted. I told them then about the estate restructuring, about the charitable trust, about the healthcare proxy no longer resting with Peter. I want to describe their reactions carefully, because they revealed something important about the difference between Peter and Denise's respective understanding of what had actually happened. Denise, to her genuine credit, seemed to grasp immediately the full weight of what her husband's casual comment and their subsequent pattern of ongoing conversations about my estate had actually represented. "Norman, I am so deeply sorry," she said. "I think somewhere along the way we let anxiety about our own financial future turn into something that made us start thinking about you in a way that dehumanized what's actually happening here, treating your eventual death like a logistics problem to solve, rather than something that's going to genuinely devastate us when it actually happens." Peter's reaction was initially more focused on damage control than genuine reflection, asking pointed questions about exactly how significantly I'd restructured my estate, questions that, I want to be honest, only reinforced my sense that the underlying pattern of thinking hadn't fully shifted, even in the immediate aftermath of being confronted directly. I want to tell you about the months that followed, because the resolution here required considerably more time and difficult conversation than that single evening alone could provide. Peter and Denise began, at my suggestion, attending family therapy sessions together, initially focused specifically on the pattern of anxious, premature financial planning that had led to the comments I'd overheard, but eventually broadening into a more comprehensive examination of how Peter's own unprocessed grief and anticipatory anxiety about losing me, following so closely after losing his mother, had manifested in this particular troubling way. I want to describe how that suggestion actually came about, because it wasn't something I proposed immediately during our initial confrontation, but rather something that emerged from a follow-up conversation about 2 weeks later, once the initial shock of the confrontation had settled somewhat for all three of us. Denise called me directly, without Peter present, asking whether I'd be open to the idea, explaining that she'd been researching therapists specializing in grief and family estate dynamics, having recognized in the aftermath of our conversation a pattern in Peter's behavior that she suspected extended considerably deeper than the specific comments I'd overheard. I appreciated her initiative in that moment, understanding it as a genuine, independent effort to address the underlying issue, rather than simply managing the immediate fallout from having been caught. "I think I never actually let myself grieve losing Mom properly," Peter told me during one of our subsequent conversations, several months after the initial confrontation. "I think some part of me started preemptively grieving you instead, treating your eventual death as this inevitable, imminent thing I needed to prepare for, financially, because actually sitting with the emotional reality of potentially losing you too felt like more than I could handle directly. It doesn't excuse what I said, but I think understanding where it actually came from has helped me start addressing it more." Honestly, I want to be honest that I found this explanation genuinely helpful in processing my own complicated feelings about the entire situation, without allowing it to fully excuse or minimize what had actually happened. Understanding the underlying psychological pattern didn't change the fact that Peter had spent 3 years quietly treating my remaining life as a financial variable to be managed, rather than something to be genuinely valued and protected. I remember discussing this specific tension with Councilman Doyle, my old engineering colleague who I'd appointed as my healthcare proxy in place of Peter, over coffee one afternoon several months into this process. Everett, who'd known both Peter and Judith for decades, offered a perspective that helped me significantly in reconciling my competing feelings. "Norman," he said, "understanding why someone did something terrible doesn't obligate you to pretend it wasn't terrible. You can hold both truths at once, that Peter's behavior came from a genuinely difficult, unprocessed grief, and that it also caused you genuine, serious harm that deserved a serious, considered response.
The two things aren't in conflict with each other, whatever Peter might eventually want to believe about how quickly you should simply move past it.
I want to tell you about where things stand now, roughly 4 months after that confrontation. I haven't reversed the estate restructuring, and I want to be clear that I don't intend to fully reverse it, viewing the charitable scholarship fund specifically as a genuinely meaningful legacy I want to maintain, regardless of how my relationship with Peter continues to evolve. I have, however, restored Peter as my healthcare pratu, following several months of consistent, demonstrated effort on his part to engage with our relationship in a considerably more emotionally honest way than existed.
Before all of this came to light, our Thursday dinners continue, though they carry a different quality now, a specific honesty about mortality, about grief, about the actual emotional complexity of an aging parent and an adult child navigating the genuine uncertainty of how much time remains together, rather than the strange, unspoken avoidance that apparently existed beneath the surface of our relationship for years before I overheard that fateful conversation. I noticed this shift most clearly during a conversation just last month, when Peter, unprompted, asked me directly what I actually wanted my final years to look like, not in terms of estate planning or financial logistics, but in terms of genuine experience, relationships, the specific texture of how I hoped to spend whatever time remained. It was a question that 3 years earlier would have felt impossibly foreign coming from him, given everything I now understood about how he'd apparently been thinking about my remaining time. I told him honestly that I wanted more of exactly what we were doing in that moment. Direct, honest conversation, unafraid of the genuine uncertainty and eventual loss that comes with loving someone who won't be here forever, rather than the strange, avoidant practicality that had apparently characterized his private thinking for years before that hallway conversation forced everything into the open. I think about that evening often, standing in my own hallway with cooling tea in my hand. And I think, too, about the specific decision I made in that moment, not to immediately confront Peter, choosing instead to let that overheard sentence quietly reshape 3 years of deliberate, careful living, rather than a single explosive confrontation. I think about the scholarship students I've come to know through the workshop, several of whom will graduate and begin engineering programs in the coming years, their educations partly funded by a trust that exists in some strange, roundabout way because my own son once assumed I wouldn't be around long enough for it to matter how I chose to use my remaining resources. I don't know, even now, whether that was entirely the right approach, but I know that those 3 years, difficult as the underlying knowledge sometimes was to carry silently, produced a version of my remaining life that felt considerably more actively chosen, more genuinely mine, than the passive existence I might have continued indefinitely had I never overheard Peter's casual, careless assessment of my remaining time. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever discovered that someone close to you had already, in some fundamental way, written you off before your time had actually come, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened at the first scholarship recipient's graduation ceremony, and whether Peter finally understood the full significance of what that fund actually represented, that's a story too. Let me know. One final thought before I close this out. Patricia, my attorney, told me something during one of our later meetings that I've carried with me since. "Norman," she said, "in nearly 20 years of doing this work, I've come to believe that how a person handles discovering they've been quietly written off often reveals more about their character than the discovery itself ever could. You could have reacted with pure anger. You could have simply cut Peter off entirely. Instead, you used it as a foundation to build something genuinely meaningful for yourself and for people you'll never even...
I don't know if I'd fully articulated that framing to myself before she said it, but I've thought about it often since, understanding, finally, that the 3 years following that overheard sentence became, in their own strange way, some of the most genuinely purposeful years of my entire life. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.